Okay, this is chapter 5, part 5. Let's continue on with this, fairly long list of theories of crime, competing theories of crime. Be careful as you study for the quiz for this chapter, because there's a tendency when you have a long list of theories for them to start to sound like each other and for your mind to get muddled. So you've got to, study carefully and be able to separate these theories by some key element, and hopefully I'm getting right down to the core part of the theory that sets it apart from other theories. So this next one here kind of goes along with the personality approach that we talked about before, but here you have a focus on a specific trait, one specific trait called low self-control. And so according to this theory, criminal behavior is the result of not having learned to control one's impulses as a child. So according to this theory, we're all born with sort of the inability to sort of think about the consequences of our behavior and to sort of plan our behavior with the consequences in mind. We just act impulsively when we're little. And also we don't really consider the feelings and the rights of other people. It's something that has to be learned. And according to this theory, it's learned fairly early in childhood throughout the first few years of life through being taught by one's parents, one's caregivers, whoever's taking care of the child, that those caregivers have to give consistent correction, is a word that they'll use, so every time the child acts in an impulsive way, you need to have a caregiver intervene and say, no, you can't act like that. You can't steal a toy. You need to share. You need to learn to take turns. You need to be respectful. You can't hit or, kick or bite other children, that kind of thing. Anytime the child acts out, for them to be able to learn self-control, you have to have a caregiver intervene and say, well, not acceptable, can't happen, and there has to be consequences for this sort of impulsive behavior. And then according to this theory, over the years, throughout early childhood, step by step, after hundreds of these moments, these learning moments, the child gradually develops a character, a personality trait of sort of thinking through things before they act, and not just following their impulses, but planning and thinking through an action to consider the consequences. And once you develop that habit, that's that kind of character that controls yourself, well, then you stay out of trouble. You don't commit crimes, because the idea here is that the crimes are acts of impulsivity. They're actions where you have a quick impulse and you act on it. You don't restrain yourself, and then you might regret it later that you punched somebody, for example, in the heat of the moment when you were really angry. Afterwards, you might regret it, but you just didn't have the check over your impulses, the control over your impulses, and so you got yourself into trouble. So that is self-control theory. Again, it's a form of personality theory, but one that focuses on one personality trait and one trait that, according to this theory, develops through proper parenting, and it happens fairly early in one's childhood. Now, related, even though social or self-control theory was sort of developed by people with kind of a sociological orientation, that's actually unusual, because most of these personality approaches are developed by psychologists. And it's the same kind of folks, psychologists, psychiatrists, those sorts of people, who also have this, really it is sort of a personality approach to use terms like psychopath, or this term you see here, antisocial personality disorder, which is a very closely related concept to psychopath. It's a propensity or a tendency to fail to conform to norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness, disregard for safety, irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. So you have a whole sort of pattern of erratic, irresponsible problematic behavior that's really sort of a lifestyle of irresponsible behavior. Some of it is going to be illegal, and some of it's just going to be legal but still irresponsible behavior. Say, for example, like impulsive habitual gambling or something like that might be perfectly illegal, but still a problem. So this type of approach is really like a personality approach, that the idea is you have these enduring characteristics that are not easy to change, and that they're rooted to some extent in the structure and the functioning of the brain. And so these approaches, personality approaches, and these personality disorder approaches tend to place importance on early childhood, on genes, on brain development and function. So they have a strong sort of biological component to them. Still, like we talked about the genetic research, these researchers recognize the importance of the environment too, but they do also recognize and sometimes focus on the importance of these biological factors. So again, you can kind of think these personality perspectives as focusing on the inner qualities of a person, the inside, specifically the brain, whereas most of these theories that come from more of a sociological perspective, or maybe an economic perspective, they tend to look at your circumstances, what's outside of you, pushing and pulling you towards crime. That's the case with this. This is a traditional sociological theory, social disorganization theory. And in a nutshell, it says that crime is the result of a community's institutions, the institutions especially that are in charge of taking care of kids. So we're talking families, schools, churches, the workplace, sports, community organizations, after-school activities, all that kind of stuff. The institutions that take care of kids, if they are not doing their jobs, if they don't function well to socialize children, meaning to teach them how to behave correctly and to develop habits and values against crime, well, what happens is that the neighborhood, this is an example of a theory that tends to focus on the community or tends to focus on the neighborhood. The neighborhood is going to have a high crime rate if its institutions are weak, if they are lacking in resources, lacking in sort of the people who are doing a good job supervising and training, teaching kids. And so this theory would say if you scan a city and see that some neighborhoods have a low level of crime and other neighborhoods have a high level of crime, the ones with high level of crime are going to have, this theory predicts, weak families that are dysfunctional, that have kind of lost control of their kids. The kids are being, to some extent, raised by the street. Maybe the gangs of the neighborhoods are taking over and having a lot of influence in the how these kids are raised and their mentality, their view of things. The schools the same way, not able to function well, religious organizations, etc. Even the jobs are not there to train and to socialize people into law-abiding, responsible behavior. So this is an institutional sort of approach. Again, it focuses on the environment and those things that surround an individual, as opposed to focusing on the inside of the individual, internal qualities of the person. Now, another classic sociological theory that takes a different approach is called strain theory. According to this theory, crime is the result of a culture that demands economic success combined with a lack of opportunity for people to comply to that demand. So this theory was really designed many decades ago to try to explain the United States, because the perception was, especially go back to the 1930s during the Depression, you had or the 1920s during Prohibition, you had all these these newspaper stories of gangsters like Al Capone with the drive-by shootings and the Tommy guns and organized crime going through the roof and this bootlegging liquor and all that kind of thing. And so researchers got the impression the United States is really seems to be uniquely prone to crime compared to other Western countries, say England, Germany, France, those kind of countries. The United States seems to have a crime problem. Why would that be? What's unique about the United States? And the answer that the researchers developed was that what makes us different from, say, Western Europe is that they have a real class society traditionally, and not so much nowadays, but traditionally they had a society where you were basically born into a certain class, poor, middle class, upper class, and the expectation was that you would probably stay there your whole life and not move around. And people were kind of used to that idea of whatever station that they were born into, they'd stay there. But the United States, we have had traditionally a different culture where this idea of rags to riches, and that really you can be anybody, and you can work really hard and eventually become economically successful, and it's just really up to you. So there was this culture that developed that basically everybody could be economically successful, and if you didn't become economically successful, it sort of reflects badly on you, like you didn't apply yourself, that you were kind of a slacker. And so, according to this research, there's pressure on all of us to become economically successful, and if we're not, regardless of what station of life or what social class we're born into, the pressure is on all of us to become wealthy. And if we don't find opportunities to be able to become economically successful, well, that cultural pressure is on you to succeed if you want to be somebody. So people will turn to crime. A life of crime, say, for example, like an Al Capone sort of person, will turn to crime as an alternative path to wealth. That, yes, you're earning money illegally, maybe by selling drugs or something, but you're still getting that quote-unquote American dream of wealth. And in America, according to this theory, that's what really matters is getting the American dream. It doesn't matter so much how you get it. That's again what the theory says. So it's really a theory that's designed to try to explain crime, particularly in the United States. So that's a theory that's been around for a long time, but because of certain weaknesses of the theory, which I won't get into now, there's been other theories since that original strain theory that have been developed to try to improve on it and to try to overcome some of the weaknesses or criticisms of the theory. And the most recent and well-received theory is called general strain. According to general strain theory, crime is the result of experiencing aversive emotions and lacking the skills to handle those emotions in a constructive way. So let's put it in a little bit plainer English. What this theory says is that all of us experience stressful events, situations in our lives, but some of us experience more of that than other people. And some of us can have coping skills to be able to handle those negative experiences better than other people. So the people who have poor coping skills and who also live in an environment, live in social circumstances, say poverty, for example, an abusive, dysfunctional home, for example, that when you're surrounded by all these stressors, these negative events that are very stressful, these strains that we're talking about, that creates negative emotions in a person: anger, fear, anxiety, nervousness, sadness, depression, etc. And that whenever you feel intense negative emotions, people try to figure out how to handle those somehow. And so, according to this theory, if they don't have good coping skills, they have a tendency to handle these strong negative emotions in a counterproductive way. So you get really angry, and you don't have the skills to handle that anger, so you strike out and you hit somebody. Or you're feeling really depressed and miserable and scared and traumatized because maybe you're a child who's a victim of different types of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, coming up in a family, and so that's causing you all these negative emotions. And you know, what am I going to do with all these negative emotions? Well, you run away from home, which is a status offense, which is something that's considered like a form of delinquent behavior to run away from home. But it's a way of handling a situation that you don't know how to handle it otherwise, where the emotions are negative and intense, and you're trying to do something to deal with these unpleasant feelings. So general strain theory, even though the obvious sort of behavior that this theory would try to explain would be like anger leading to violence, but it can explain a lot of other theories too, potentially. For example, if your life is filled with stress and depression and sadness and anxiety and worries, you may turn to drugs as a way to cope with those negative emotions, and you're basically, they call that self-medicating, where you're using these drugs to make yourself feel better. So again, another form of it, if it's illegal behavior, if you're using illicit drugs or using drugs improperly, then you've got drug abuse. So general strain theory, it's not really that closely connected to the original strain theory, but it's a popular theory these days, and it offers something different than other theories because it focuses a lot on emotions. And most of these theories focus on like attitudes and the way you look at things, perceptions, values, that kind of thing. This theory is different because it focuses on emotions. And finally here, this delinquent subculture theories. Take a look at that, in the textbook, or this little single sentence here about this perspective, and it's another one that sort of flows from strain theory. It's an update, trying to go in a different direction, a spin-off of strain theory, trying to improve on certain things. But in the interest of time, I'll skip this one. But all of these that I skip are still good to know. They all contribute something. But I'll go ahead and stop there, and then we'll continue on the next slide in the next segment.